Hey class, so I am so excited to share this book with you. This book is titled Falling In, and it is by the author Frances Dowell. And you might recognize the author's title because this is actually the same author as Phineas McGuire. And I know you guys have really enjoyed that book. I know many of you have came up and asked, I want to read more books like Phineas McGuire. So I'm excited to share this one with you because it is the same author, so I think you guys will really enjoy it. Now, this is very different from Phineas McGuire. This book is really neat. It's about a girl who lives a normal life, but she's kind of always on the edge of entering this other universe, this other world. She's always hoping to kind of tiptoe or fall into some sort of different universe. So I'm really excited to share this with you guys. I am going to read to you the first chapter, and I hope that you guys will decide to check this out. I think you will all really enjoy it. Chapter 1. On the morning the story begins, Isabel Bean was convinced that she was teetering on the edge of the universe, which is why, instead of copying spelling words off the board as instructed by Miss Sharp, she had her ear pressed to her desk. All morning, a strange sensation had buzzed along her fingers every time she put her pencil to a piece of paper, and by the time spelling period had come around, she had determined that the buzzing was coming up from the floor, through the desk legs and up the desktop. She closed her eyes in order to concentrate more fully on the buzzing. It was like the buzz that a house makes when it thinks no one's home. The refrigerator humming, a little tune, the computer purring in the corner, cable lines wheezing softly as they snaked through the walls and underneath the floorboards. Being a careful listener from way back, Isabel knew this wasn't the school buzzing. Elliott P. Handel Middle School had never buzzed. In the mornings it rumbled and moaned as the children settled themselves into their desk and teachers cleared their throats. And in the quiet of the afternoon, students, janitors, and administrator assistants dozing off in corners, it emitted a low-pitched whine as though begging someone to bring it a glass of water. So if it wasn't the school that was causing Isabella's ears to tingle, then what? Isabella felt if she could just hold her head still enough for just a few seconds more, the answer would rise up from the floor and deposit itself into her brain. And maybe, finally, the floor would open up beneath her and she would fall into a far more interesting place than Miss Thalie Sharpie's 6th grade classroom. Isabella Bean, I've asked you a question. What is your answer, please? Isabella's head jerked up and snapped back so violently she was surprised it didn't fly straight off her neck. Miss Sharpie's squeal of a voice always had this effect on her various limbs and appendages, as though Isabella were a puppet and Miss Sharp's high-pitched voice her master. Fortunately for Isabella, Miss Sharp's general inclination was to ignore her, but even Miss Sharp couldn't ignore what appeared to be blatant napping. And your answer is? Miss Sharp drummed her fingers against the desk to demonstrate her impatience. 197, Isabella guessed, remembering a moment too late that it was spelling period and not math. Her classmates twittered and giggled. One boy in particular, Ferguson Morse, was especially tickled by Isabella's answer, and when Ferguson was tickled, he began to hiccup violently. Ferguson's hiccup caused Monroe Lark to laugh, so he rolled out of his chair and into the middle of the aisle. Within seconds, the class was in a complete uproar. Isabella Bean, Miss Sharp bellowed from the front of the classroom, pointing a finger violently towards the door, to the principal's office. Isabella sighed, a feather-brushed sort of sigh. Why, always the same old thing. Couldn't Miss Sharp come up with something more original? Why not shoot Isabel out of a cannon, send her flying over the top of a playground's monkey bars? Why not enlist her in the Foreign Legion and deport her to the deepest, darkest France? That was the problem with adults, Isabella thought sadly as she stood and brushed a few eraser crumbs from her lap. They lacked originality. Why, just this morning over breakfast, her mother had made the most hopeless, boring suggestion that she and Isabella should go shopping this weekend. Janice Tribble told me there was a big sale at the mall, her mother said, reaching across the table for the jam jar. 20% off everything at the Junior Wear Jamboree. You want me to go to the mall? Isabella could hardly believe it. The mall, home of dreary raincoats and unnecessary sportswear, capital of cinnamon buns that smelled wonderful but tasted like sponges left for months under the sink. The very thought made Isabella want to lie down and go to sleep for 100 years. People do it all the time, Isabella, her mother said in a weary voice. A V of disappointment or worry or sadness, or some heavy-hearted combination of all three, appeared between her eyes. It's quite a convenient way to purchase clothing. I've decided to make all my clothing from now on, Isabella reported. The idea had burst into her head that very second. The way ideas do all the time. Ideas, the little constellations of sparks and light and bright colors, and she immediately liked it. So what if she didn't exactly know how to sew? So what if she had the dexterity of web-toed walrus? Why should that stop her? Izzy, you can't even, her mother started, then stopped. She studied the jam jar. Boysenberry, Isabella's favorite. Then carefully dolloped a blob onto her toast and spread it with the back of her spoon, before cutting the toast into 4 little triangles. As she lifted a triangle to her mouth and began nibbling on a corner, a splash of jam dripped on her chin, and Isabella thought about reaching across the table to dab it with her napkin, but decided she liked how the blob of jam looked. Like a beauty mark, she thought. I just remembered that I'm allergic to the mall, Isabella said after a few moments of her mother's chewing. But if you really want to go shopping, maybe we could go to the thrift store. That could be fun, don't you think? Miss Bean grimaced. Hand-me-down clothes? I wore them my whole childhood. They smell like addicts and old people snoring. Sometimes they do, Isabella agreed, but sometimes they don't. Besides, you can always wash them. The smell never goes away, no matter how many washings, Miss Bean said, tucking the last bit of toast in her mouth. Picking up her plate, she stood to go into the kitchen, then paused and looked back at Isabella, her face brightening. How about catalogs? We could order some new things from catalogs. Oh, what was the use? Isabella nodded at her mother. Sure, maybe we could do that. Grown-ups, she thought as she grabbed her backpack to go meet the bus. The mall, catalogs. Why couldn't they ever do the slightest bit unusual, unexpected? Laziness, maybe, or lack of imagination. That was it, lack of imagination. Sometimes Isabella dreaded growing up. The path to the Vice Principal Kloski's office was a familiar route. Over the years, Isabella had demonstrated an impressive talent for irritating teachers to the extremes of their patience. It wasn't something she set out to do. In fact, she never quite understood what she did to raise her teachers' blood pressure to such dangerous levels. Neither did her teachers, and this irritated them even more. Teachers' College had equipped them to handle nose pickers, fire starters, backtalkers, hitters, fighters, and whiners. But quiet girls who weren't shy, girls who talked in riddles but were never actually rude, girls who simply refused to comb those confounded bangs out of their eyes, well, girls like that were beyond them. Isabella slowed to admire the latest crop of 5th graders' artwork hanging on the wall between Miss Palmer and Miss Wren's classroom, and took a moment to peer into the cafeteria, which seemed to her a more cheerful place at 9:30 in the morning than it was when it was overtaken by screaming kids and yellow trays, still steaming from the dishwasher. Reaching to the door, Vice Principal Kloski's outer office, she decided a short rest was in order. She enjoyed her visit with the vice principal, but resting now would serve in the long run to delay her return to Miss Sharp's classroom. The hallway's gray linoleum felt cool beneath her legs, which Isabella had stretched out in front of her so she could examine her boots. She'd found them the day before in a pile of junk set out for the garbage collectors. And I'll show you guys the boots again so you can see them. They're like red rain boots. Isabella couldn't resist picking through roadside junk. Much to her mother's dismay, she made loads of good finds over the years, including a bike with a bent tire that had only taken 2 good thwacks of hammer to restore its proper alignment, and a goldfish, still very much alive, swimming in a goldfish bowl. Although her mother had a strict no pet policy, Isabella had been able to effectively argue that fish were not pets since you couldn't actually pet them. The boots had been stuffed under the cushion of a crumbling bear clounger. They were women's red leather lace-up boots, shiny and new-looking, flat-heeled with surprisingly pointy toes. Isabella's feet had grown 2 sizes over the past summer, and the boots fit her nicely. Once she'd stuffed some toilet paper in them. And while it would be hard to argue that they, in a way, matched her current outfit of a hooded gray sweater and loose jeans, Isabella felt that her boots somewhat completed her. She looked up when she heard giggling voices floating down the hall. 2 girls in gym suits walked towards her, or rather, one's walking and the other was limping. Her arm flung around the other girl's shoulder as if to steady her. Isabella recognizing the limping girl as Charlie Bender. If you had to see somebody in the hallway, Charlie Bender wasn't so bad, Isabella supposed. She wasn't exactly Isabella's cup of tea, but she was okay for the kind of girl who was usually picked 3rd or 4th for games in PE, who stuttered a bit at the beginning of class presentations, but calmed down after a minute or 2, and was only halfway boring on the topic of major domestic imports of southern Lithuania. But Isabella had noticed that Charlie Bender was one of the few people at school who said hello to Morris Cranoff, a boy who had to wear a shoe with a special raised heel, because his left leg was shorter than his right. And so she guessed that Charlie was decent for someone who was average as an apricot. Were apricots average? Isabella wondered. Better make that apples or acorns. Is the nurse in? Charlie called to her as though Isabella was the receptionist. I need her to wrap my ankle. Gopher hole. Gopher hole, what? Isabella asked. Gopher hole who? She stepped in a gopher hole, bird brain, Charlie's helper said. She's lucky she didn't break her ankle. Lucky, Isabella mouthed to herself. Now that was the truth. Girls like Charlie Bender were usually lucky in her experience. Why was that? Where other people would have broken 5 bones in their foot, the Charlie Benders of the world only twisted their ankle. They were forever reaching the doorway just as the rain began to pour from the sky, or jumping onto the curb only seconds before the speeding car rounded the corner. What fairies stood over the cradle and cast their lucky spells that day Charlie Bender was born? So have you seen the nurse? Charlie asked again. I'm not here to see the nurse, Isabella replied. Charlie sighed. Maybe I'll just check for myself. She poked her head into the doorway, one door down from the principal's office. Is she there? Her friend asked. Because Miss Lasso said I had to get right back to class, but I guess I could wait with you if the nurse isn't there. Not there, Charlie reported. But I can wait by myself, I don't mind. Not needing any further encouragement, her friend turned and trotted back down the hallway. Charlie Bender disappeared into the nurse's office, and Isabella resumed admiring her red boots. A sudden squeak, followed by a piercing squeal, punctured Isabella's reserve. Both noises came from the nurse's office. Isabella was sure the squeal had issued forth from the mouth of Charlie Bender, but where had the squeak come from? Intrigued, she decided to investigate. So that is chapter 1 of Falling In. So I hope you guys like that. I know I definitely am ready to read chapter 2 and see what that squeal was. So this is a really cool book. I think you will love seeing all the different places that Isabella wanders into and what happens. So if you guys want to read this, come and find me and we can get you a copy of this book.